class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 67 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Minnesota Wild, in which the Sharks have lost 5-2. Now, in the two prior meetings this season between these two teams, the Sharks were actually victorious. So they were coming into this game looking to complete a season series sweep, but unfortunately it would not end up being the case. However, like the St. Louis game in the previous one, this was a game in which the Sharks actually looked pretty good. So a decently fun one to watch at the very least. Now, this first period starts off kind of poorly for San Jose. Obviously, just 2 minutes in, they give up the first goal to Jared Spurgeon to make it 1-0 Minnesota. But besides that one goal against, the Sharks were the significantly better team in this first period, got a ton of chances, and the real difference maker was the Wild goaltender Marc-Andre Fleury, which of course will be a very familiar name for many Sharks fans due to his few years with the Vegas Golden Knights at the height of the San Jose Sharks Vegas Golden Knights big rivalry they met in the playoffs for those couple of years. So, of course, the Sharks very familiar with Fleury and very familiar that when he is on his game, he is very, very good. And the Sharks definitely got a feel for that in that first period. However, early in the second period, the Sharks would end up getting on a power play, and Logan Couture would be able to tie this game up at 1. So we have a new ball game suddenly. And the Sharks in the second period were still very good, playing some solid hockey, really keeping the Wild on their heels for much of this game at this point. And the Wild are one of the better teams in the Western Conference, so it's rather impressive from San Jose. But there was a very major turning point as we moved into the latter part of the second period, and that was with Evgeny Svechnikov. He is getting in the face of Marc-Andre Fleury, which you don't hate from Svechnikov, but he then ends up sort of getting challenged a bit by Marcus Foligno. They have an interaction, and then instead of just skating away from that with no penalties assessed, let's just move on, Svechnikov actually returns to continue to bother Marc-Andre Fleury and ends up getting called for a slashing penalty. And on this very same power play for the Wild, they managed to get the go-ahead goal with less than 2 minutes to go in the second period from Goodrow, and so they're taking a lead and into the final frame. And this was just not a very good look from Svechnikov. I'm not entirely sure if he even got a shift. I think he had one shift for the rest of the game, clearly not looked upon. And so while I have at times criticized David Quinn for the benching of certain players, cough cough Kevin LeBanc, him benching, or almost entirely benching, Evgeny Svechnikov for the rest of this game, I definitely do agree with, because it was just an undisciplined play. And it really ended up being the turning point of this game, because not only does this allow the Wild to take back a lead and play with the lead, which they have been very good with, especially as of late. They've let in basically no goals in each of their last 12 or so games at this point, but it also gives them the momentum because it is a late period goal, which are always very killer. And in the third period, we saw what that momentum brought them. Just 30 seconds into it, Marcus Johansson scores to make it 3-1 Minnesota. So suddenly a already tough comeback from just one goal down is made into a tougher comeback with 2 goals down. Having said that, the Sharks come relatively close. They end up with a power play a few minutes into this third period, and just 8 seconds into said power play, it is Tomas Hertl who scores to make it 3-2 and close the lead back to just 1 goal. At this point, Wild head coach Dean Evason decides to challenge for the goaltender interference, and I originally thought that this goal would get called off. We see in the overhead angle that Tomas Hertl pushes Marc-Andre Fleury with his stick, knocks him down, and so it seems as though it's going to get called back, but upon a second look from a better angle, you could say, it does seem as though Spurgeon actually hooks Tomas Hertl and kind of forces his stick to go in this awkward position, and so the referee also sees it this way, and as such the goal stands. The Sharks get another power play, an opportunity to tie this game, since the 2 prior goals for the Sharks this game have been on the power play, but they never get that equalizer. Eventually the Wild score on their own power play from Zuccarello to make it 4-2, and then an empty netter is added right at the end there for good measure, I guess, as the Sharks will drop it 5-2. On to the bottom of the standings watch. It was a very good day for the San Jose Sharks yesterday. There were only 2 games in action, but both games very interesting from a Sharks perspective. The Blackhawks and the Anaheim Ducks in action. The Ducks were actually victorious in regulation, surprisingly enough, over the Calgary Flames, so they jump up to 53 points in their 66 games. Meanwhile, the Blackhawks, while they didn't win, even though it looked like they might very well do so, going into the third period up 2-0 over the Florida Panthers, it would be an overtime loss, bumping them up to 50 points and actually surpassing the San Jose Sharks because they have the game in hand. So the Sharks, coming into today, found themselves second last in the league, a coveted spot for sure. On the other hand, today was less successful from a Sharks perspective. While the Coyotes would add an overtime loss, jumping them up to 57 points, making this very difficult for them to ever fall below to the San Jose Sharks at this point. They seem to just be above these 4 other teams. The Blackhawks played and lost. The Blue Jackets played and lost. The Sharks did keep pace in that regard by losing here tonight against the Minnesota Wild, but they will otherwise stay exactly where they are in a pretty precarious second to last spot, with the Blackhawks still tied with them. And of course, every spot matters at this point. Even being second last in the standings here, the most likely situation that occurs based off of the draft lottery is that the Sharks drop 2 spots to 4th round. That is the more often than not type of situation. That's just sort of how the odds actually work out. So getting low enough in the standings each and every time is important to try and get you as high of a pick, or your best odds of getting as high of a pick as possible. So for instance, if we take a look at the Blue Jackets in that last place spot, they're most likely, technically, to fall to 3rd place in the draft. I believe it's like a 55% chance of that happening. And so you want to be able to get that last spot so you'll have at best, or at worst, that 3rd overall pick. Anyhow, moving to the players to talk about, Barabanov, Couture, and Andreas Johnson. Going to start off with Johnson, who I kind of criticized quite heavily at the end of the St. Louis Blues game a couple of days ago, saying that he just hasn't really proven himself here with the San Jose Sharks. It was a great opportunity for him coming over to be able to play in the top 6, and he hasn't done anything with it. Well, that did change at least somewhat here tonight. Nothing amazing, certainly not the standout player on this line. That honor does usually go to Alexander Barabanov, or at least it has as of late. But Johnson definitely was better. There have been times already with the San Jose Sharks that he has been like a situation where if you had told me Johnson hadn't played that night, I would have believed you. But here tonight, I definitely noticed him, and he was noticeably better for sure. When it comes to the second line, certainly their best game of I can't really say of the season because they've only been together for like 5 or 6 games at this point. Eklund and Zetterlund have actually been on the team, but definitely their best game as a trio. Fantastic. Hertl, probably his best game or I can't say that, but one of his best games of the season, I would say. Gets the goal, had that scary moment where on that goal he ends up getting slashed in the face with Marc-Andre Fleury's skate, but seems to be no worse for wear. Great game for him, seemingly rejuvenated by the fact he's playing with these 2 younger, newer type of players to the Sharks roster. William Eklund, also his best game in teal thus far, or I can't really say in teal because the Barracuda also wear teal, but his best game with the San Jose Sharks thus far this season. Definitely much improved from the previous game. Still no points, still no goal, anything like that, but he had multiple chances to score a goal himself. He set up multiple chances for other players on his team to score a goal. And so recently I've been giving Eklund a rating on 10, and he's usually floating around 5.5 or 6. I would probably give Eklund around a 7.5 here tonight. Now, the reason I give it, you might be saying, oh, well, you praised him a lot. 7.5 seems relatively low. Well, there has to be kind of a room to grow. Obviously, if he had scored like 2 goals to go with that, he'd probably get like a 9 or even a 9.5 because he played so fantastic here tonight. But a 7.5 still seems very fair, still a very good game. There were obviously a couple of issues, a couple turnovers that occurred, both of them actually going to the same Wild player, Matt Boldy. But besides that, nice game for him for sure. When it comes to the final player on this line, Zetterlund, on the other hand, I also thought played rather well here tonight, but it still goes back to the point I made in my St. Louis review that he just seems to be a step behind the likes of both Hertl and Eklund, and not necessarily the most complimentary player in this situation, even though indeed it was a decent game for him. When it comes to the third line, I mean, Svechnikov we saw didn't really play much near the end of this game, but Gregor I thought stood out in a very positive light once again, his second straight very good game, and so it's nice to see that there is some consistency here in the bottom six, because while we have seen players like Sturm, like Svechnikov even have like some stints of, a few games where they're playing very, very well, nothing necessarily lasts all that much. Gregor, this is only a couple of games. It probably won't last that much either, but the fact that you can have at least one or two guys going in the bottom six over multiple nights is at least decent enough for a team that finds themselves so low in the standings. Obviously, if they had a better six, they might not be this the better bottom six, they might not be this low, but still, good game, Noah Gregor. When it comes to the fourth line, Lindblom, Lorentz, and LeBanc obviously as of late has been having some issues with the David Quinn benching situation, has at times played less than 5 minutes of ice time in a particular game because of it, but here tonight was given a bit more of a leash because he was having a very good game, actually had a couple of really nice chances here tonight, opportunities to for sure score at least one goal, but it wasn't just him on this line doing it. I also thought Lindblom had a pretty solid game as well, so generally a good game for the fourth line for sure. When it comes to the defensive side of things, we have as the top pairing, of course, Karlsson and Knyzhov, and in the similar theme of Eklund having his best game of the season for the Sharks and Hertl having one of his best games, I also thought that newcomer, I guess you could say, Nikolai Knyzhov also had potentially his best game thus far, only has played a few games due to massive injuries that have kept him out since the 2021 season, but he's definitely coming back up to speed and is reminding me and Sharks fans of why he was actually such a consistent player for the San Jose Sharks back 2 years ago when he played all 56 games of the regular season at that time, and he had done so, by the way, on a pairing with Erik Karlsson, reunited here 2 years later and still doing very well. So I was impressed with Knyzhov. Again, like with Eklund, it wasn't a perfect game devoid of any errors, but the couple of errors were definitely overshadowed by the multiple nice plays that he made on the defensive side of things. The other defenseman who I do want to talk about is Derek Pouliot, who I will say I thought actually had a pretty decent game. Nothing amazing, but rather solid. But it really kind of bothers me in a situation like this when the bottom pairing for the San Jose Sharks, or any pairing for the San Jose Sharks, has two left-handed defensemen. We see Karlsson and Knyzhov right-handed and left-handed, Vlasic and Benning left-handed and right-handed, but here it is Pouliot and Ferraro, both are left-handed defensemen, and of course there are some defensemen who will say, well, I can play both sides, and that might be technically true, but the fact is that when you're trying to keep the puck in your own zone, if you're a left-handed defenseman on that right side, you're likely having to play the puck along the boards on your backhand, and we saw once in this game Derek Pouliot essentially unable to keep this puck in the zone, is unable to make the nice play on his backhand, and that ends up being a clear. And while this is only something that happened once in this game, it still is a situation where it's not particularly optimal, I would say. So it's still a good game for Derek Pouliot. I'm not blaming him for that situation, but it's just an awkward spot where the Sharks, not necessarily as many NHL-ready defensemen to be able to fill into the 3-3 spots. And then finally we have James Reimer, who I thought played a decent game, I guess. There were definitely some very nice saves earlier on in this game, and a couple of these goals he didn't necessarily have that much of a chance on, but you are kind of left with the feeling of having just watched Marc-Andre Fleury make many, many great saves for the Minnesota Wild, and then you watch James Reimer when he's called upon not necessarily making those very same saves, that it kind of feels like a bit of a goalie duel lost here tonight, but I guess it wasn't completely terrible. As that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday, where they will take on their most important game of the season for sure as we move into the final 15 games, and that will be against the Columbus Blue Jackets. If the Sharks win that game, they likely can kiss their hopes of coming last place in the league goodbye, but if the Sharks do lose that one, of course there are still a couple of things that can change depending on if Columbus has games over the next couple of days, but if they don't, or if they lose or whatever, if the Sharks lose that game, suddenly they're within 1 point of the Blue Jackets for that last place spot, and we would be in for a very interesting end of the season. So we shall see what happens there. Definitely, like I said, one of their most important, if not their most important game at this point. Class dismissed.